this Bloomberg article that just dropped. So if you haven't read it, there's this article about the big hack. And both Joe and I are quoted in that article, and our quotes are used to kind of talk about the possibility that there's this itty-bitty tiny chip that Chinese government has implanted on a bunch of supermicro motherboards, and it has infiltrated 30 companies in the United States, which is all a very interesting and entertaining story. But you know, when many of us are hardware people or technical people who get really excited about the capability and what's possible. And I myself am very excited, like when I hear descriptions of these things, like, wow, like we could do this, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this, and now we have a proof of concept. And very frequently encounter people who take the words that I say about a proof of concept and think that this is, you know, the next attack, and it's actually happening. Sometimes there are more conspiracy theorists than others, but this was just a really interesting thing because it ended up in a mainstream media news article that had some pretty significant impacts on the industry. So Joe and I decided that the best way we could respond to this is to turn this keynote slot into a panel. We have a couple people from Portland and beyond that are knowledgeable about the stuff that happens, so we kind of lured us all together. And then we thought, well, we need someone to moderate the panel, and we both thought that there really is no one better than Kim Zetter to come and moderate the panel if we could just convince her to get up here to do it. So thank you very, very much, Kim Zetter. I've had the privilege of getting to know her, meeting several times at conferences all over the place. We've talked several times. She has been working on technical journalism for 15 years, quite a while, and like election security for over 10 years. She had an excellent, was it the New York Times Magazine cover story? Or was it, yeah, so on election security earlier this month. She's kind of the person we thought would be best to do this, and she said yes, so she's here.
I think it's safe to say, too, that Kim is one of the few journalists that we actually trust, and that's saying a lot, given, as you'll see when we talk about this article. So she's been around, and you know, yeah, thank you for coming.
Joe just has to say that because he spent last week bashing all journalists. And I got pissed off with him about it,
So without further ado, I was going to say one more thing. I can't remember what it was, but maybe I'll just interrupt. Oh, lightning bolts are still here. So Kim, here you go.
Did you want to introduce the panel? Or
OK. So shall we start with Jason and come back this way and just tell us about yourself and what your experience with hardware implants and hardware might be?
Yeah, so the format here is we're just going to go down the panel, have them introduce themselves, describe a little bit about the hardware hacking they do, and then we'll jump into the article. And we don't want to spend a lot of time bashing the article, just examining sort of what are the fallacies and what are the possibilities, and then broaden that to all of the hardware hacking. So.
I guess I came late, so I get to go first. My name's Jason Meltzer. Hello. Hi, my name's Jason Meltzer. I guess that this is always the big existential question when you get this shoved in front of you from a group of people. How am I going to describe myself today? So for the last 2 years, I've been working with NCC Group's hardware and embedded security practice. We look at a lot of whether it's from mobile devices to server hardware for a lot of companies, a lot of embedded security stuff that goes into even servers. One project that I can talk about that we just recently actually published a public report on was the encrypted backup feature, and it's an Android P. And there's there's a feature that allows Google to that allows you to have the backup encryption keys tied to your lock screen knowledge factor. That Google never has access to any of this data, and so they brought us in and we looked at all of the hardware that underpins this. This includes the Google what's called publicly as the Titan chip. So this is the kind of stuff that I've been doing for the last few years. Previous to that, I was a security researcher at Intel doing CPU core or internal security stuff, microcode stuff, and And then before that, lots of other system security stuff. But that's sort of where I come from.
Hi, I'm Rukila or Mike, and I started in embedded hardware and software and built little embedded things, and then I drifted around in development and into software security, et cetera. And I kept running into people who would, say the hardware adversaries are out of scope, like, when they hook up hardware, it's game over, and that kind of pissed me off. And so for lols, I just make hardware implants to show that, like, we're thinking about the hardware security threat model wrong. And for work, I work on the Intel Red team, and we do adversary modeling, and it's fun.
My name's Mickey. I work for a small company that does hardware and firmware security called Eclipsium. I had a lot of experience looking at motherboards and working with Mike. Recently, I've looked at a lot of Supermicro boards, and it's a very, very fun topic.
Found anything interesting on any of those?
Maybe I'll tell you about it.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm Mike Grover, MG, on Twitter. Recently, I've been playing around with USB-based implants, like implants that go inside of these cables. Kind of a focus on doing it with really common and really cheap implant hardware, just as a fun constraint. And yeah, that's about it.
I'm Joe Fitzpatrick.
Well, hold on a second. Can you just expound on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, totally.
Tell me about what you're...
Yeah, so I mean, the implants in this cable, for instance, the demo has been HID attacks where it pretends to be a keyboard and types really fast on your computer. So yeah, you'll plug in this to your laptop, it'll charge your phone, and it'll also type on your computer for you. Got a few other ones that are USB based, where they're kind of emulating network, things like that. So. And an exploding one too, just for fun. Yes, yeah. If you find a thumb drive that explodes, I may have created that. Yeah, smoke too.
So I'm Joe Fitzpatrick. I did hardware security previously at Intel, but the past several years I've worked a lot reproducing things from the Ant catalog, which I found to be really fascinating. All these hardware implants, and what was the big learning key element from the Ant catalog was that these hardware implants are used to give software access, and then it becomes a software problem. My experience at hardware is like, oh, I'm a hardware person, I have a hardware background, I can do everything in hardware, but no, we do stuff in software. I've built JTAG implants, I've built PCI Express implants, I've applied these implants to industrial control systems, to embedded devices, to PCs, all as demos and proofs of concept. I've never seen a real implant aside from like counterfeit bypass devices. No one's ever shown me one. So, Joe, have you ever seen one?
I have also never seen one, but I've seen a lot of your examples. And the Ant catalog is actually interesting because what you guys have done with the NSA playset is sort of like using off-the-shelf consumer stuff. You haven't had to create, ridiculously tiny, complex systems. My name is Joe Grand. I have, I feel really old. I've been hacking on things since 1982. I'm a professional electrical engineer, so I have production manufacturing experience, but I've been in the hacker world for that whole time since I was a little kid, and just love designing things, love breaking things, and just sort of always kind of a curmudgeon and kind of skeptic when it comes to a lot of things. And yeah, for this particular article, Joe and I were both quoted, but I should mention, since I'm wearing a hat, which most people never see me in a hat, I had quoted about this implant as being so, actually it wasn't even about this implant. The quote was this general quote about how hard it is to actually find, if there even is one that exists, a real good state-sponsored hardware implant that's the secret thing that's actually physically done on the board. If it's that good, then it would be like seeing a unicorn jump over a rainbow. Hence my hat, if you can see it in the back. I had this made at the county fair a few years ago before I gave the quote, and it's not exactly the unicorn jumping over the rainbow, but it's as good as the guy could do. So I figured I'd wear it today. But yeah, so hardware hacker and just engineer.
I was trying to look for that exact quote because it's actually a great quote, but I can't find it. This, the Bloomberg article, I'm going to hold on, 'cause this is our, so the Bloomberg article is actually very lengthy, if all of you have read it, but there's only one line in it that actually it describes in any kind of technical term of what's happening here. And there are actually two articles. So there was the first article that talks about the hardware implant on the board, and then the second article that came out like the day after, a week after or so. So here's the one technical line in the article. Sorry? Okay, so officials familiar with the investigation say the primary role of implants such as these is to open doors that other attackers can go through. Quote, hardware attacks are about access, one former official puts it. In simplified terms, the implants on Supermicro hardware manipulated the core operating infrastructure manipulated the core operating instructions that tell the server what to do as data move across the motherboard. Two people familiar with the chips say. This happened at a crucial moment as small bits of the operating system were being stored in the board's temporary memory en route to the server's central processor, the CPU. The implant was placed on the board in a way that allowed it to effectively edit this information queue, injecting its own code or altering the order of the instructions the CPU was meant to follow. Deviously small changes could create disastrous effects. So, I want to throw it out to the panel. You know, the article has received a lot of ridicule. But you've all sort of said in one way or another that the capabilities are not implausible. So, sort of, I want you to reconcile those two issues, that the article itself is implausible, but the capabilities are plausible. So.
You want to start?
So that is an interesting technical description because any of us who are familiar with like the inner workings of things, those aren't words that we use to describe how it works. Those are words that a journalist would use to describe something to a mainstream audience. So we can't interpret that sentence literally. We have to interpret it through a filter designed for a mainstream audience. That said, what it's describing is modifying instructions, changing the sequence of instructions. It reminds me a little bit of like the wording in the Wassenaar arrangement about like the expected path of execution. And basically what I hear is like this is how exploitation happens, right? We do something external to modify how things execute. So it's hard to extract any technical detail about what's going on. When we get over to the more low-level hardware side, where we talk about hooking things into the system and wiring them up, and the overall capabilities, like, can we have something that goes and modifies memory in a system? Yes, we have technical ways to do that. We can use PCI Express DMA attacks. We can use debuggers to do that. When we talk about interrupting the CPU, do we have that? Yes, built into every CPU is debug features that let you halt execution and change what it does. And these are things that are documented or not documented, and if you're a state spectrum actor, you have access to that documentation. So none of the technical details are implausible, but what really gets me is the combination of all of them in a strange way.
Tell the audience.
Tell the audience where that sentence came from?
No, you're telling me.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
You don't have to talk to me.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, that's. I guess a little bit of backstory too. So this article came out, was it less than a month ago now, right? A few weeks ago. Joe and I had both been contacted by the journalists nearly 2 years ago. So this article is not something that just came out like, you know, this new investigation. They've been working on it for a long time. And what we came to realize is the journalists were independently contacting us, basically asking sort of these somewhat technical sentences that didn't exactly make sense, like what could you do with something the size of a grain of rice on a motherboard, or this or that, like very vague sort of things. And neither of us ever actually knew the whole story of what was going on, but we didn't realize this until after the fact, that they were bouncing our responses off of each other to find something that seemed to make sense. So I think the article, and I haven't talked to the reporter since, and I won't, because I spent enough time trying to educate them in the first place. But it seems like he had maybe been fed something and then started down this path, this sort of domino effect of like, well, Joe said this, some other guy said this, you know, trying to piece together something so it doesn't technically make sense as like a technical person would read it, but somebody from the outside, and this is sort of where the danger is that somebody who isn't technical is going to read that and go, oh my God, we're going to blame China, we're going to blame all these bad things. And the whole thing with hardware implants and what this article is really focusing on is the danger of offshore manufacturing and untrusted facilities in hostile territories. But hardware implants can be done anywhere along the life cycle at any manufacturing facility. It doesn't have to be offshore. It can be in the United States. It could be down the street, because there's a million ways to do it along the way. So it's just, I think the article was very unfair, and especially to the public, sort of very misleading in a way that now we have to deal with the ramifications of that.
But why is it misleading if you're saying that the capabilities are there, that everything it's describing doing is possible, and it's raising awareness for looking for hardware implants? It's raising the issue of hardware implants. What's the problem exactly?
I think raising awareness is great. So being able to say, here's a potential problem, here's an attack vector people haven't looked at before, and raising that to the mainstream is good. If there's no hard facts, it's misleading. So speculation is different. If the article was like, we think this happened, this could happen, we think maybe this happened, but they're basically presenting it as, here's even the picture, who's wearing the shirt? So this shirt, oh, it's on the screen, yeah. So that picture with the pencil and that little thing on top was in the article, sort of without a description of saying, this is what we think an implant would look like. There's no mention. People thought that picture, which was in the article, was the actual implant discovered. So, but it wasn't. And the pictures they show of where the implant could be on the motherboard, where it zooms in, that wasn't real either. So it's a lot of, from a high level, it's good.
But they do have sources saying, not on the record, I mean, they're anonymous sources. They do have sources saying that they've seen the implant, they've seen reports of people who found the implants. So I guess I'm still not convinced by you guys. What is wrong with this article?
Oh, I will also say Joe and I were, I could go on a long time about this. Joe and I were contacted to speculate on where in the image that they could show in there was the actual thing, because their 17 anonymous sources didn't show them an actual picture.
It would be interesting to kind of dive into the implausibility of this, because while practical and not practical, there's potential in doing it the way it was presented, but the practicality, there's so many other approaches, and it might be worth distinguishing, the different ways in which it is plausible, whether it's hardware attacks versus software, firmware, et cetera. And I think those become more practical.
Anyone else on the panel?
Mickey, Mikey, Jason, do you have any ideas of how you would do it that wouldn't involve nearly as much hardware?
How much money you got? Nation state. So if we think nation state, that's like, okay, so it's really hard to talk about this topic without going super technical. But if we consider nation state that has like a budget, look at the Ant catalog. What was the cost for?
Just to make sure, does everyone in the room know what the Ant catalog is? Is there anyone who doesn't? So the Ant catalog was leaked to Der Spiegel back in 2013 or 14. It was basically a catalog of the NSA's implants, spyware, toolkit. It was, as I recall, technology from 2008.
Yes.
But it wasn't leaked until around 2014. So the state of the art, we presumably were a decade on from that. But it was quite sophisticated, of the catalog. Go ahead.
Yeah, keeping that in mind, a decade-old technology and a catalog that has implants on it, that the cost of each goes, I think, at least $50,000 per unit, and you can buy them in packs. Yeah. So if you have like $1.2 million, you get a set of 50 or something like that.
This was an actual catalog. It was a sales ordering catalog for spies.
There are cheaper.
Yeah, there are cheaper options, right? But if we're like thinking about that and then moving our minds 10 years in the future with the technology we have today and thinking about, for example, the nanometers then manufacturing it versus nanometers now, you can do a lot of things in a really small package if you have a lot of money. Now, let's say you have the capability and the money. You have an implant. You still have to find the place on the board to put that implant that gives you capabilities. Now, it's really hard to find a place on the board to give you multiple capabilities. And that's why everything is possible, but you'd have to adjust a few things in the way. If you're a nation state and you have spies and you infiltrated the supply chain, there's so many ways you can do this. I don't even know where to start. But let's say you just have an implant.
So there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah.
But do any of the ways you would do it involve making a custom chip, putting it on a board in a place that doesn't make sense, in a package that you would never find on a motherboard?
When you say it like that, no, it's just a red flag. Yeah, I would totally do a fake package.
And why would you do it at the manufacturing plant? Why not do interdiction?
I wouldn't do it in a manufacturing plant,
Right.
but that's a different discussion.
Okay.
Like, you don't know how I would do it.
I think there's
We do,
something
actually,
though.
we do.
Like a lot of the discussion online and like this question is, well, maybe we should not, maybe the article is not right because they're doing it as a hardware implant and not a software or firmware one. But I'm not sure that's the right way to go because it could possibly be a hardware one. I don't know why they would do it, right? But maybe there's a reason if they're doing, maybe they already have checks in place during manufacturing to check the state of firmware. So they have to do it after firmware's been manufactured before, as it's loaded to the BMC in power up, but not during manufacturing or something like that, right? So there might be a reason. It seems completely ridiculous to any of us, but we also don't know the whole story if it was a hardware, if it was hardware, and if so, there are plenty of ways to hide it, right? It's just like if it was done right, it wouldn't have been discovered, and since we haven't seen pictures, we don't know if it's been discovered. So, there might be a reason to do it, but we just don't. We haven't seen anything. There's no proof at all. No proof, no packet captures, no nothing.
Also, there's so many usual suspects in this chain. So in a motherboard, you can name a lot of companies that are involved in manufacturing components to any motherboard from any manufacturer. So it's all based on trust. So if you trust the OEM that gives you the component, that's good. But if someone infiltrated that one, you can't tell.
So have any of you ever found suspicious, malicious, let's say, implant on a motherboard?
No, I've never seen anything. I've seen dumb designs, but I've not seen maliciously a malicious implant, except what Mike did. But
I've seen counterfeit bypass
mics.
devices. So you have, let's say, a router that's an 8-port router, but it's the same board as the 16-port router, and you go and you solder on 8 extra ports, and you put this bypass circuitry on there that bypasses the DRM that the manufacturer puts on them. So you sell this, you buy a $1,000 8-port strip switch, you solder some components on, you sell it at a $3,000 16-port switch, right? So it's malicious. It's someone doing this to swindle, to make money.
But not to spy.
But it's not a spy, implant. And yeah, it's the same. It would be the same hardware, right? It would look exactly the same. And if you didn't know what you were doing, you saw this. Like that's what people. There was a post on Reddit a few years ago of someone who found an eBay purchase. So it had one of these things on it, and it's pretty certain that this was a counterfeit bypass switch, not an implant, a spy implant.
Yeah, that was on Reddit. That was that the Cisco router? Yeah. Someone bought one, and it looked a little bit physically different than the other one that they bought. And they opened it up, and there was this hardware implant on there. It was like an inch square with no silk screen markings on it, just horrible soldering job down onto the board. But a huge discussion. Like you should search for Cisco implant Reddit, and tons of people trying to figure out what it was and what we think it is, because there's only 2 connections plus power and ground. And I'd actually talked to a few people that had slightly more insight than we do about what it might be, and they were thinking it was bypassing, but basically a feature upgrade. So during power up, and I don't know if this is true for real, but during power up, the system's going to check a serial number or the state of something. So this implant is going to modify that to basically give it a different serial number or a different key or whatever it needs to be to unlock the features that are already existing on the board. I think another good thing to think about sort of hardware implants in the real world would be like mod chips on game consoles, right? Those are like intentional hardware implants where we're putting them there or somebody's putting them there to, again, maybe be malicious because if they're bypassing some security mechanism, they probably aren't spying, but that's like a real world hardware implant that I think everybody has seen. As far as like malicious, intentional ones on boards, I've never seen it in my entire life of tearing stuff apart and talking to people, and I would love to. I'm just dying to see something. Credit card skimmers are another implant, and I've seen those, right? Those exist. We know those exist, but other stuff, I'm just dying for somebody to send us pictures or something because we really want to see one. Otherwise, we can only sort of speculate or kind of share what we would do, but not know what the adversary is really doing.
at the end of the table there? We haven't heard from you guys.
So I think it's kind of interesting to think about mod chips where in the console market, the adversary that's implanting hardware is definitely in scope into their threat model. Like, this is exactly what they're afraid of. And, you know, it's a cat and mouse game, whereas in the server motherboard business, this seems to be something that we don't talk about and is generally thought of as outside of the threat model.
I just want to add something. I don't think we'll ever see an implant like the one suggested. All right. With the gaming and modding communities, the user consents to know that there is something on it. He accepts the fact there's something there. I want it there because I want to play all my games. When a malicious actor tries to add a malicious component to a board, the user should not know. So you shouldn't be able to detect it unless the malicious user knows how to.
Well, the interesting thing, I mean, the way that they described that was detected was the traffic going out to the malicious server.
That's another discussion.
Okay.
That's the. I don't want to. Are we going to talk about that point?
Yes, I'm asking you about it.
Are you going to talk about that?
Do you not want to talk about that?
I'll let Joe start.
So I guess we're getting into the issue of like how do you detect? Let's unless anyone else wants to continue on that.
I wanted to add
where
one
we
more
were.
point to the
Yeah.
practicality.
Yeah.
For instance, this little thing, right? In terms of the practicality here, this is mobile. It's not the system itself. It comes with the human aspect. Therefore, it kind of makes sense. Doing a hardware implant on the physical system itself, there's a lot more complications. And look, we don't know the whole complexity, the intent, and the constraints they had here. We're just talking generally as a general approach, but it's a lot easier to go at the firmware or the software level. Even this, it immediately hands off to software. It's like, okay, it's infected, now it's in the system, then it's done. That is where it's much easier. It's much more flexible. You're in the user space. When you're at the hardware level, there's so many more constraints, and anytime something changes on that hardware, flash update, like your hardware implant may therefore break, and potentially catastrophically, to the point where somebody notices that it is implanted, and you don't want that, especially when it's at a large scale, when it's coming from the source, and you have a lot less control of where it ends up.
So there was so before we get into the detection, there was a second story that came out from Bloomberg afterwards, and it seemed to be a follow-up to the first story, but then it was talking about something different. This one was by a guy from Sepio Systems, Yossi Appelbaum, who said that he found this on a telecom, didn't identify the telecom, and the way that they discovered it was unusual communications from a Supermicro server, and a subsequent physical inspection revealed an implant built into the server's Ethernet connector. So in the first story, they were talking about this implant on the motherboard that then communicates, calls home to this malicious server, and apparently all of the implants were calling out to the same server because supposedly some Intel source then got access to this server, and they were seeing what systems were communicating with it, and that's how they were able to determine that about 30 companies were affected by this. So let's throw that to the panel and talk about that method of discovery and other methods. Let's say the plausibility of that first, and then in general how you might discover an implant.
Okay, I'll start. If I take your description literally and I think about it for a second, that sounds like a BMC. So that's if you don't know, BMC stands for Baseboard Management Controller. It's a separate subsystem that is located on most servers, allows companies to manage their fleet of servers, like reset them, install operating systems. It's a completely separate stack of operating system on a motherboard. So some of them share a network port with the motherboard. So it's kind of described like the BMC was contacting somewhere, and that sounds like a firmware or a software kind of exploit than a hardware one, to me.
I just want to add a little backstory to that particular article, and then someone can talk more technically about it. So yes, a modified Ethernet connector sounds like a totally different description of the implant than the first one. This particular company, this second article, we don't know if that article was meant to be a was in the works at the same time as the first one. And this sort of brings into fact this whole questionable kind of ethics, I think, around this article. When the first article dropped, that weekend I got an email from a company, somebody at a company named Sepio. And they said, hey, Joe, I saw you in the Bloomberg article. I'd like to show you how we're securing hardware. And I got a million emails that day or that weekend, so I just blew it off. And then when the second article came out, Sepio Systems was featured in the article. So I was like, did they reach out to Bloomberg after the first article to say they have a solution to this problem, and this is a great way that they can now also convince the journalists, to write about it. So the second article to me seemed like not an intentional follow-up, but a follow-up to maybe try to bolster their first article and come out with something of saying, look, implants are real, so you should trust our first article. Here's a company that specializes in securing or detecting implants, so it must be real. So the whole thing was just sort of shady. And the fact that they were providing a service and the fact that they just cold call reached out to me, it didn't sit right. But again, from a functional perspective, hacking a Ethernet connector and implanting, that's a great place to hide because it's huge, right? And you could do something in there and add stuff within the connector itself. But there were some technical inefficiencies, I guess would be a word, of that article too, where they're saying that this particular physical Ethernet connector that was detected was plastic instead of metal, or no, metal instead of plastic.
Yeah.
So the metal, would act as a better heat sink for any of the processing power implanted inside of it additionally, which must be why it's implanted. And the way it was detected was not just Ethernet traffic, it was the current power consumption measured based on, I don't even know, I'm not even going to try to explain it.
It said unusual communication.
It didn't make sense.
So Sepio Systems sells a service where they can detect your maliciously implanted Ethernet ports, right? They claim to have found these ports, but they can't tell you any details about how. They claim they do this by doing analog signatures and stuff like that. Sounds like side channel analysis. And side channel analysis is complicated, and these journalists are translating. And so that description is a translation of some detection mechanism they use to detect anomalies using side channel analysis.
This is how the journalists translated it. They talk about the Sepio software detected the implant. One of the few ways to identify suspicious hardware is by looking at the lowest levels of network traffic. Those include not only normal network transmissions, but also analog signals, such as power consumption, that can indicate the presence of a covert piece of hardware. So they're not saying that the power consumption was one of the ways that this particular telecom implant was found, but they're talking about Sepio's capabilities and how they might find an implant.
Yeah, so great marketing piece.
Well, yeah, and I think this kind of wanders into...
Can I just add one other technical detail about this particular Ethernet connector? The tampered Supermicro server actually appeared on the network as two devices in one. The legitimate server was communicating one way, and the implant another, but all the traffic appeared to be coming from the same trusted server, which allowed it to bypass security filters.
Oh no, just like what Joe said earlier about these things being presented in a language that is fairly generic, super high level. That you have to having to look at these things through that lens of interpreting. Okay, well, this is sort of what they meant. This is sort of in the realm of very high, extremely abstracted possibility. I think that's partly where we start to get into like, for whose benefit is this article? And then the follow-up article, which definitely kind of reeks of opportunism, if that wasn't already in the works. Like, they presented, there's no actual evidence that's been presented. There's sort of like a somewhat pseudo-plausible technical mechanism, at which we all here have experience with, and that I don't think is in any dispute whatsoever. We can all sit down and think of hundreds and thousands of different ways of backdooring stuff, either whether it's like intentional implants, or we haven't even talked about bug doors, which make actually adding something kind of irrelevant. But we have to ask, like, well, who's benefiting from this article, and what does this article actually, what information and what are people supposed to do with it? I mean, almost nobody deals with server hardware anyways. They have no idea how to interpret this and what to do with the information. So like they've presented no evidence, they've presented no real hard evidence that anybody who's willing to stand up and actually like put their credibility on the line that isn't selling something. So it's sort of. You guys want to talk about?
One question, Mickey, Jason. Like you guys know BMCs better than I do. How difficult is it to make a server show up as 2 network devices over a single port? Is that like a core feature of some of these BMCs, maybe?
Right. That's exactly how it works.
but like.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Did everyone
Jesse,
hear the
stand
question?
That guy. Yeah, repeat the question.
So there's a question, is there anybody who's done research on BMCs and knows details about how things like this can work? And yes, there are, and yes, they have.
Yeah, we have one in the audience.
So, do you want us to say your name? Or do you want us to not say your name? Say hi to Jesse. Come talk to him later.
That's Jesse.
Sign up for a volunteer position while you're talking to him.
I mean, I think like we need to think about when we talk about, this detected network traffic, and it's sort of hinted that this is implanted hardware that is making network traffic in some kind of side channel, which is not necessary at all, right? You can, through the BMC, you can make network traffic through implanted hardware talking on the same buses as the BMC. You can also make network traffic, and like there would be no network detectable side channel signature of that. That would be indistinguishable because it's sent by the same Ethernet controller. So like that didn't really, those 2 details don't really go together. They don't really make a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, here's a question related to detection, not being a network or software person, but a lot of the discussion is, there's a detection of the hardware implant because there has to be some command and control or something, and yes, you can generate traffic, but from the people I've heard in the network world that are looking for these things now and spending a lot of time doing it, they seem pretty confident that any irregular or malicious sort of network traffic they would be able to detect because intrusion detection and all of that world of detecting network stuff is so good. And I don't know if you would agree with that. I only know that I've read stories of hacks. I don't remember what exfiltration it was of like Sony or some company where there was like some huge amount of gigabytes of data being exfiltrated straight over the network and no one detected it. So it seems unlikely, sometimes companies might not even detect a few bytes being sent. But do you think even if it's a hardware implant, could it be detected properly in a software approach in network, or is there just too much ways to hide?
I want to answer that with a question to you. Would you do a hardware implant that talks over the network?
Probably not.
Exactly.
I would do one that would exfiltrate data in a different way, not over the network, so it wouldn't be detected, and then we get into covert channels through, EM or RF or optical or whatever.
So you bring up the example of Sony getting gigabytes of data exfiltrated, but we're not talking about Sony. We're talking about Amazon and Apple, right? Their jobs are maintaining farms of servers. They are really good at this. They're probably the best in the world. And the other 30 companies on that list are probably up there, right? And when you have like a cloud service, right, you have a bunch of systems that are running other people's code, and you're very careful about what you do. And when you're building your network, when you're building a server, you have a box around everything, right? And if you're not trusting the software on the system or the operating system.
So are you seriously asserting that they're really careful about their...
Repeat. Maybe more careful than other people.
Did you just really say that data centers are really highly locked down and secure?
Thank you for catching me on that. Maybe my wording was optimistic. So when you are threat modeling a data center, you have a box around each server. So you are already suspicious of strange traffic coming out of it. You're suspicious of strange traffic coming out of the BMC. Whether or not they do a good job of detecting that or not is in question. But this is the job they're supposed to be doing, right? So I assume, without information, that companies who are doing this on huge scales are doing a better job than smaller companies. Even Sony is a much smaller company who just has their own little, like 30-some gigabyte exfiltration problem.
I just want to add, so in the scenario where there is an additional network interface popping up, that's the the equivalent of having a whole new machine just suddenly pop up in your network. That is the loudest way from a network analysis standpoint to approach this. So even just basic IDS stuff is going to catch a whole machine suddenly showing up in your network.
Everyone's saying no.
Correct. You should be tracking that, right? Like baby.
So the comment was, if you're creating and destroying, if you have a bunch of virtual infrastructure with a bunch of VMs, you're creating and destroying VMs all the time. So if one pops up in there, you may not see it. But what about even from a lower level? Like, again, I don't delve into any network stuff, but it seems like with exfiltrating data from a hardware perspective, there's so many ways. Aren't there ways within network traffic to just change some bits of a flag or something that would go undetected and someone could still do for command and control, right? Like, it's not infeasible that network traffic could get through whatever detection mechanisms, right? It's just, is that maybe just unlikely?
Then you have the issue of once someone finds the hardware implant and starts looking for that traffic, it's going to show up pretty quick.
Right.
Yeah.
Once you know to look, once you know where to look, and that's the article is saying they've detected it. We should have peak, yes.
So yeah, my mistake is.
Running an enterprise the scale of any of the data centers you described, they're not going to have PPAPs at every data traffic. At best, they're going to have net flow because they're going to be
So
Let's keep the
my
conversation.
my error is speaking beyond my expertise, which is the hardware side of things. And my thought is, once we get to the network level, there's no difference between a hardware implant and software. And then they already have these mechanisms in the software world. They may not be perfect, but they're going to find things in cases. And when we detect something and we detect it and isolate it, there's no reason we can't come up with a PCAP, an indicator of compromise of what this thing does, right? If we detect it, if we find it, if it exists. We don't have that. We have nothing to look for right now. So when you get down to the question of like, what do we do about it, which is kind of where you try to direct the conversation, like, we don't know what to do in response to this article because we don't know what the attack was that we can detect.
So maybe you don't know specifically this one, but what would be the advice then to people in data centers and CISOs and CTOs in general about this issue of implants? I mean, okay, not this one specifically maybe, but
I feel like we have to be.
I
mean, I feel like this is not a new attack vector for us, but potentially a new attack vector for other people. And I think we have to sort of, we don't want to go out there and scare everybody with this. We need to be kind of a voice of reason, like we try to do with every other attack that comes out. But I think, and Joe and I, and probably some of these other guys too, and probably a lot of people in here have gotten questions about what do we do in relation to this. And you don't want to totally discount it because it is a real threat, but it's also, like we talked about, there are lots of other ways to do it. So what I've been spending time doing with CISOs and things is not scaring them, but saying it's a possibility. You're relying on commercial, off-the-shelf hardware. You're dealing with manufacturers all over the world. You're trusting all these different things along the way. Yes, things could happen. Is it likely? Not as likely as somebody compromising firmware or phishing your employees or something. So I think it's mostly what I've just bringing it to light and saying, yes, it exists. Is it likely? No. And then they have to deal with, they understand their business to understand, like, what do they actually, do they need to go deeper in that way, or can they just, now be aware of it, but maybe not spend a lot of time on it?
I think Matt King, I quoted him, he said to me, like, if you're not, if you don't have hardware attacks in your threat model, watching the wording, if you don't have hardware attacks already in your threat model, this is the wake-up call to do it. And that's what you need to do. You need to worry about the next generation. You need to worry about talking to your suppliers about supply chain security. Tearing apart a few motherboards looking for little white chips is not going to help you. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. But having that conversation with your suppliers, if you've never had it before, this is why you need to have that conversation.
And I think that, it's also the same sort of detective control things that we've been talking about for a long time. Like, you need to think about the possibility of a compromised BMC and like what that BMC can reach. If you have a flat BMC network, that one BMC can reach all BMCs, that might be something to look at again.
Does anyone want to add to that? Because I want to open up to questions from the audience if there's nothing else to add. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Let's take from here first. And I guess I'll have to repeat the question so everyone can hear.
general public who has already been trolled and swayed on a lot of stupid things in Facebook and so forth. They've upped their game now to Bloomberg, but it may just be, to what extent do you think it's just, we're just doing this to sow more FUD in the system
So there was an article that came out. Sorry. Do you want to read it? Okay. So the question in a nutshell was basically, whose benefit is this article for? And there's been so much FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the media. What's the point? We're not the main audience. It's the rest of the world is the main audience. And what are the real reasons? We don't fully know. But there was an article that came out about Bloomberg reporting a few years ago. And I don't know if this is still true, that apparently Bloomberg journalists get bonuses based on how they move the markets, so how the markets are influenced based on their articles. The stock of Supermicro dropped 40-something% when the article came out, and it's been coming back up, so great time to buy, maybe.
Conspiracy.
Yeah, so there's sort of that theory, maybe it's just unethical reporting. People have said, well, with the whole Trump-China tariff thing, the article came out at just the right time, another China-bashing thing, and that's why I mentioned it doesn't have to be China. Implants could happen anywhere. But yeah, maybe it's used for political ammunition. The fact that the article has been in the works for so long is sort of like, well, maybe not. But yeah, you don't really know the motivations. But what I read an article that Dan Geer had sent me from Michael Crichton from 2002. I think he was giving a talk, and I don't remember where it was, but he was basically saying, from a technical perspective, if you're a technical person and you read a technical article, you go, oh, there's all these problems with it. This journalist doesn't know what they're talking about. But then you go read the rest of the paper and just assume all the other journalists about things you don't know about are correct. But it just puts this weird lens on things of, once you realize that something you read from your world is wrong, it makes you question everything else too. So I don't know. I don't know the motivations. From one hand, though, I do, maybe not to Bloomberg's credit, but the emails, it seemed like the journalists were actually genuinely interested and excited about this, like they found something. And I think maybe there was some piece of technical incompetence and being fed information in a way that they thought they were doing this amazing service, when in reality it just confused the hell out of everybody.
I do want to just add from a journalist perspective that this story is sort of at the nexus of two of the most difficult things for a journalist to cover, and that is national security classified information. Because you've got sources that aren't necessarily going to be able to give you the whole picture, but they'll give you pieces of it, and you may have different sources in different areas. We'll give a piece here, a piece here, a piece here, and your job then is to try and pull this all together in a viable way and a plausible way. Attach that, the technical issue, where you've got two reporters who don't necessarily have a background in technology, don't have a good track record in covering technology, and so you have two possible problems here with where you're going to run into issues. Anyways, I'll open it back up to the audience, and I'll take one from over here. Yeah.
Aside from the BMC, are there other areas of the motherboard that would make a tiny bit more sense to take advantage of to perform malicious activities?
Just repeat the question
Yes.
before you answer.
Repeat the question.
Oh, no, we should read that. So are there other places you would build something in, other places that it would be easier or more effective to do this? And when I read the article and I see the details and put them together with the full information, like what this tells me is I2C. I2C is a 2-wire interface. It connects a lot of low-level sensors and things on a motherboard. And it's very easy to build a little 4-chip thing that speaks I2C and talks to all these devices, right? It's simple, it's low power, it's very well understood, and it connects very important things in the chip. I've seen systems that have I2C routed in ways that let you have debug capability of chips on the board over I2C, right? I've seen systems where you can write software that will be able to communicate over I2C and tell devices to turn on and off features on the board, power ranges on the board, clocks on the board. So we do have a lot of potential for things like this, but again, that's not what the article was telling us about. Maybe you guys want to add to that?
Well, talking about little things. TPMs are a great one. I actually don't work for NCC Group anymore. I resigned on Wednesday, but so I'm not shilling for my former employer. But one of my colleague, we did a gig on some server hardware that a company was deploying in remote data centers, and one of the things that we started poking at was there was like the TPMs on a lot of servers are on some sort of expander card or daughter card that's just entirely removable. It's this little extra card. You have no idea what's on this little daughter card. Like all things like that, we found a whole bunch of bugs in all of the software that speaks with the TPM, both in UEFI and in things like even like T-boot for doing measured and attested boot. As I'll look at the chipsec people and stuff like that when I say this and fixing it, because those guys helping fix those bugs. But that's where, like as Joe said, there's like there's all sorts of different kinds of peripherals that speak on different kinds of buses that are like, especially the I2C stuff, I2C. Whatever.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying, so Jason, you're saying TPM, Trusted Platform Module, I'm being sarcastic, a part that's supposed to be providing hardware security for a motherboard can be man-in-the-middled and tampered with? So basically the attempt of the motherboard world to try to have something secure can be tampered with because it's over I2C or over something else, right?
Maybe I'll take this opportunity to make a bold claim and say that that basically a physical attacker wasn't really in the threat model for how TPMs are like TPMs at all.
But they should be.
Well, it very much should have been. Yeah,
but yeah,
and this is changing, and this is things that TCG, or the Trusted Computing Group, that manages all the standards that go into things like TPMs and stuff like that, or define what they are. I mean, they are aware of this, and they are trying to fix it and stuff. So
it used to be that like physical access, like the actual ability to touch the system and manipulate it and attack it, that's only in the threat models for game consoles, and then like we've added phones to that for the most part. We don't have that threat model built into the past 60 years of building computers, right? We have cases where suddenly we realize it is in the threat model, where we have like the flip the laptop over and reprogram the BIOS because you stole someone's laptop and you want to bypass their login password or something like that. Evil maid attacks. Like evil maid attacks are this like, hey, we need to consider physical attacks on laptops. And now this is, hey, we need to consider physical attacks on server. So we need to look at our threat models, we like to look at our planning process and our design process and realize, hey, is physical access something we need to be concerned about? Or is it more realistic for us to build more secure software and have this constraint and say, hey, this server must not get physical access by anyone, including anyone in the supply chain? Like,
and that's an interesting point, because even most chips that are out there, if you've worked with designing low-level hardware, they're including the TPM, any interface on the board, there's very few cases where there's actually protection of data in transit, right? Or any encryption or any authentication. The chips themselves don't support it because, going back to physical access was never a threat. The problem is, even though physical access is now a threat, there still aren't solutions for that, and there won't be for a while until the chips themselves have enough security built in where doing hardware interdiction or hardware implant is going to make it way harder. You know, engineers aren't going to implement security on their own. It's just not going to happen. So everything's in the clear, including TPM, including I2C, including SPI, the LPC bus, the post bus. Like all this stuff is totally open, and any of those could be implantable. Whether it's going to have the same result as the Supermicro, which presumably was about the BMC, we don't know. But there's lots of places to implant because things are just, everyone's talking in the clear on the boards.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting to look at like DTPM, because like the hardware threat model of the DTPM is like, well, we have the secure element, which is, you know, all FIPSy, and you know, it keeps your secret, but like it's not within the threat model to say like, oh, I could make an evil TPM that has different properties or does something else. It's all about, does this thing have the security, you know, does this little element have the security properties that you assume it has?
Mike, can you tell me a little more about people's assumptions of hardware security items and whether they should trust them or not implicitly?
Are we sowing FUD now or what?
No. I was, you know, like Doobie Keys. You know, are they good? I think they're an improvement.
You know, we don't trust software because we can inspect it and we know it's made of crap. So what we need is we need something immutable, something perfect and wonderful like hardware, and we don't want it to be crap. So we want to make it so we can't inspect it. So, you know, it must not be crap because we can't inspect it, and therefore everything is good. Unfortunately, the world we live in now is that we have people who wanted to make hardware who didn't learn how to write software that now writes software that makes hardware.
don't you have some of those pieces in your little pouch?
I have, yeah, I do have some Doobie Keys. It's just like a YubiKey, except for it has the opposite security properties of a YubiKey. Instead of keeping your secret deep inside and being unwilling to have it extracted even by an advanced adversary, every time you plug it in, it just sprays it to everybody.
Okay,
Luckily, it doesn't look that much like a YubiKey.
let's take a question over here.
So, Jason or Mike said something I think that is pretty. The future is we're all not using hardware businesses, right? Nike's shifting over to the cloud, like their entire infrastructure, right? So no one's having a conversation with their hardware manufacturers. Apple and Amazon, they're having discussions with their hardware manufacturers. Like we're downstream of that, right?
Did everyone hear the question?
Yeah, the cloud is just other people's computers, right? And the big companies aren't manufacturing their own; they're just using somebody else's service, and you're just now trusting that the provider of that service is talking to the manufacturers and doing things properly. And yeah, there's risk along the way, but there's turtles all the way down or something. I don't know if that's the right saying, but it sounds good.
The question was about, like, when everybody's going cloud, like, what is it? What power do we have? We just have software. We don't trust the hardware. If we look at like phones, right? The iPhone, you've got one model that is like every single iPhone. It's the same. They build the security qualities in, and it's identical for everyone. When we have a situation where every single company is having their own hardware server and they're buying from a different manufacturer and all this stuff, like, there's a huge realm of what's possible and what's breakable. And it's just, the effort for security goes into one model of one server, and it is less efficient. When we go to the model where we have these cloud providers, right, Apple, Amazon, Google, they're going to put the effort into unifying their architecture. Instead of putting all this effort into securing one model that's, they sell 1 million servers, they put all the, 10 times the effort because they're selling 10 million servers. So there is benefit there to having this homogenization and having this, offload this. Like, people don't know how to handle hardware issues. They're having trouble with software issues, which is why we're going to cloud. So I think there's a potential that these companies are going to have a better grasp of this, and after some news, maybe they will put more effort into supply chain security. I think we're headed in the right direction, but we're not there yet, that's for sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really interested in the journalism aspect of the story, so I'm interested in your opinion about, was this article appropriate to ever be published to begin with, given the reliance solely on anonymous sources? What would you advise to people communicating with journalists about technical stories? Would it make sense to have published the second story that had far more technical details so that we wouldn't spend a whole bunch of time just talking about reading the tea leaves in the article, that kind of stuff?
Does everyone hear the question? Okay. Just quickly, he's wondering, like, should the article have been published at all, or how should it have been done differently? Should have been followed up with a more technical article. I don't think that they could do a more technical article because I don't think that they had the capabilities in staff for someone to do it. I think that so it's tough. They're citing 17 anonymous sources. That's a lot of anonymous sources, but we don't know the quality of those sources. And they're saying top-level intelligence officials, things like that. We have to trust what that means. When you're a journalist and you're trying to give someone anonymity, you're trying to give them distance from their knowledge of something, because you don't want to say top official in the White House, because that's too narrow, right? So you want to broaden it and make it as broad a description of this expert as you can, so someone can't really identify them. So top intel official can be multitudes of many things, right? They're saying that the investigation is done by counterintel of FBI, so that maybe could narrow it. These were maybe top FBI counterintel officials. We don't know. It's a problem for other journalists. There was a really great quote in the Washington Post done by their media writer. He said, "Good journalism should be able to be reverse engineered." Other journalists should be able to follow up the story. I mean, we often see that, right? You get a story, let's say, about the New York Times breaks a story about warrantless wiretapping from the Bush administration. in 2006, and it's immediately followed up with other stories from the Washington Post and from other outlets who then go to their sources and they're able to confirm this. No one else is able to confirm this, in part because there aren't a lot of details that you can pick up on. But even the detail of a manufacturing plant in China, a chip found in Supermicro, there are enough really specific details in here that every journalist should be able to go back to their own intel sources and say, what's up? And we all got blank stares. We don't know. So. I don't want to dismiss the article entirely. The plausibility is there of implants. I agree with Joe that maybe there were wires crossed, and they got information from here that they combined with information here, combined with information over here, and it's sort of a conglomeration of mud in the end, with some concern still. Yeah.
Question: how do you protect yourself in journalism from sources who are pushing?
Who have an agenda. Every source has an agenda. Joe has an agenda. Everyone on this panel, when they speak to a journalist, has an agenda. You can decide whether or not their agenda is benign, helpful to the reader, or malicious, or political, or whatever, but every source has an agenda. That doesn't make them a bad source. You just, as a journalist, your job is to know what the agenda is and to work around it. Is the agenda that they're trying to pull one over on you? Well, you don't rely on one source, right? You want to get multiple sources and weigh information against each other. But yeah, everyone has an agenda, and so you have to figure out, and even a whistleblower, right? Everyone always says whistleblowers are disgruntled workers. That doesn't disqualify what they have to blow the whistle about. So it doesn't matter if someone's agenda is a negative, if it's a revenge, payback, whatever. What you want to focus on as a journalist is the information. Is it viable information? Can you confirm it? That's what it comes down to.
I think to go along to answer Jared's question in relation to that is every source might have an agenda, but every journalist has an agenda, right? So that's the thing to be careful of is these journalists might have already had an agenda of what they wanted to do using us and using anonymous sources as a way to get there. But to answer Jared's question about how can we talk to journalists, which is a totally, we could have an entire session on how to talk to the media. But I remember something as a kid being told, no matter what a journalist asks you, you can always answer with what you want to say. So they could ask a completely separate question, and it's like if you're pushing, futile or whatever it is, it's like you can always answer regardless of I believe in this and say it. It doesn't mean they're going to take it. If it's on film, it's more likely maybe they'll use it if you keep repeating that, or they just won't use you at all. But if it's in written, you just try to do your best to push again your agenda the way that you're trying to educate them. But just remember that they can always use that in different ways. And we've had that experience through the Loft with MTV. Really screwed us one time. We thought we were feeding them the right information, and then they took it and pushed their agenda. And so sometimes you don't know, but you just have to be careful of what you say.
Does this panel go to 10:30? Because we're now at 10:30.
10:45.
Oh, we have some more time. Let me just take a question over here, and then I'll come back to the middle room. Is there anyone over here? Okay. Back to the middle. Or let me go here. Okay, and then I'll come back. Yeah.
So why didn't Supermicro kind of like come up with a circuit diagram and say, this is the chip, it's nothing offensive or bad on it? It wouldn't have had their stock price crash so bad.
But you're assuming that chip exists.
Or the location of where it was or something. I don't know. I mean,
well,
how often do you release your schematics to prove a point? Yeah. Depends on how, I don't think they're open source hardware, so they might be a little tentative in doing that. Or maybe it's going to try to show if they're defending it that much, maybe they appear guilty or something.
Yeah, you release your IP, it's just you lose money. It's thousands of hours goes into developing these schematics per product line, and you don't just like, oh, hey, here you go. Look at all my secret stuff.
And if you
Would it be possible to buy a Supermicro board off of eBay or something and see what the heck that chip is?
I think everyone in the country has been kind of looking at their Supermicro boards, so you don't have to go to eBay to get one.
You keep assuming that chip exists.
That's the basic question that's still.
It's the golden ticket on the chocolate bar, except there are no golden tickets.
But supposedly there's golden tickets in every single one.
Yeah. So let's buy them all.
Let's go to another question. Yeah.
So back to the journalistic integrity kind of stuff.
I didn't realize that I was going to be on the show.
I do kind of feel like there at least is some a little bit of value in the lower or technical, poorly sourced articles, because we have had situations where, there's kind of, anonymous sources say this stuff, and then you have NSA officials dismissing it, which then inspire people like Mark Klein to then dump documents, who then inspires Manning, who then inspires Snowden.
Sure. So so you're talking about something entirely different here. You're talking about it's often good to have an unofficial anonymous source hang themselves, to actually take a quote from someone, get it out there in the public, so that the real people who know the real information can come back and counter them. We had that with Clapper, right? So Clapper goes in to testify towards Congress and says that, and the question to him is, does the NSA connect to dossiers, collect information on any Americans? And he goes on record and says absolutely not. And what do we get in response? We get Snowden dumping documents, say, oops, you are. So yeah, so there is value in journalists sort of reporting anonymous sources that maybe are getting information wrong or are misrepresenting it, and that does open the way for people sources who ordinarily wouldn't go to a journalist. They absolutely would never talk to a journalist, and they see something like that, like Snowden, never would have gone to a journalist. They see something like that, and that's the motivation to sort of let's set the record straight. Question in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, I realize a lot of this is speculation, so you can answer as you're able, and you may not even be able to speak into it. I think it's more of a supply chain question. In speculation, if this chip existed, where in the supply chain would you be able to put that on a board? Would it be at any point in the supply chain? I have a little more though. But specifically asking, would you be able to ensure its delivery to the source that you're targeting? Because working with the military, I've never worked with hardware, but I've worked with software. I know that there are several things we have to do to verify before we put something into the wild to control where it's going to go. Because the last thing you want is a chip like this getting into places you don't want it, with consumers and sources you don't want to have. And so where in the line would they have to be able to identify and guarantee where this is going to do something like that?
So from a kind of hardware perspective, talking about the story, they say that this implant was seeded onto the board, meaning that it was implanted not as an extra add-on module, but as an extra chip or within an existing chip on the board. So that would have had to be done by the manufacturer, which actually they say was a subcontractor for Supermicro, so one of many contract manufacturers building stuff. That would have been in the parts acquisition stage. And we know even within the military, there's like, I think, I'm not going to quote the number because I can't remember it, but some huge percentage of parts are counterfeit or bad in some way because the government requirements anyway, you have to buy components that aren't manufactured anymore. So you have to go through these parts distributors that are harvesting parts from old things. So yeah, you have questionable supply chain even before parts get to the factory. The article itself had said that some Chinese official had pressured somebody within the factory to implant the part. But yeah, you could get the parts beforehand. But when they're implanted on the board, the way that I would do this is, the engineers who are designing the system, even if there's 100 of them working on the motherboard, when it's going through the actual initial pre-production stage, sort of prototyping and pre-production stage, people have their eyes on everything, right? They're looking at everything, they're testing everything. So an implant at that stage would be detected fairly easily by the engineers or by the test engineers or manufacturers. But once the system goes into production, I know personally, and anybody who's designed hardware can probably attest to this, is once something's in production, you don't really look at it again, right? You maybe do a spot check once in a while to make sure your quality is still good, but the engineers who designed it aren't looking at it anymore. Then it's just manufacturing. So I would say after pre-production, once the system goes into production is when a rev could be made. Maybe they just call it an engineering change order of a vendor change, and then slap that in, and then maybe there's the test procedures are not written to look for it because they're written for the version before that. So I think there is a way to get it in, but again, it's all why.
The article specifically says, I think the wording is, Supermicro excelled in the industry because they provide unmatched customization or something like that. So basically, if you're buying 10 million servers and 10 million boards, and you tell them exactly what you want, and then they go and they make those 10 million boards all at the same time. And like Joe said, there'll be some qualification testing and everything, but then when it's time to make 10 million boards, they're just going to do them all at once, right? And it's assembly. You're already getting a machine to put all these components on the board. What's really easy is swapping a reel out, right? You swap a reel out of 2,000 resistors with 2,000 implants, and that's where you do it, right? And it's swapping a reel. And if it looks the same, you're not going to pick it up visually. If it functions the same, you're not going to pick it up. So like speculating, this is all speculation, right? That's where you do it. That's how you do it. And that's how it happens, and that's how it doesn't get detected, right? So it's not like magic that they know that like, oh, well, I'm going to do this board and roll the dice, and there's an odds that it'll go to the United States, and maybe it'll go get sold to Apple. It's like, okay, there's an order for 10 million boards or 10,000 boards. I don't know the numbers. And it all goes down, and all the way at the factory, they know exactly where this lot is going on the way out.
So, like, but this also points to the difficulty in making something like that, that you need to be able to provide an implant that does not measurably impact the reliability or the performance of the item. And you need to be really sure of that, because that is the way your operation is going to get burned, is when things start going into RMA at unusual rates. And that's when people start investigating.
RMA? Explain.
Yeah.
Well, return. When the people start returning them, they start investigating, why is this happening? The people who design the board are the people who start investigating.
Even if you, let's assume you have a perfect implant, non-detectable, no RMAs, it's amazing. You still have a target. And the farther back you go in the production to implant your chip, it's a shotgun, right? The closer you are to the barrel, the more precise you are. And the barrel being the source of the implant. If you put it in the reel, like Joe suggested, you're going to hit everyone who gets the board. If you want to be more specific, you need to involve more humans in the process. And exposing more people in and up gets more risky from getting discovered.
Could this be why the Ant catalog is showing physical things that you can add on after the device has been manufactured, because you're targeting one person instead of selling chip level things that could be implanted during supply chain?
Or maybe interdicting packages.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Chris, yeah. You.
So I'm listening to this, and I know that there's an application issue and security issues with the Internet of Things, and I have looked into that a lot. But all of a sudden, people are going to be carrying just things around that may have wireless access, and they may be able to scan things. And how does that impact, and how do you speak to a public where this is also a situation?
I'm going to say something before Joe says something. Quickly, all those IoT devices that talk to, we're looking into the future, near future of 5G. Everyone's going to have something that talks to something. But all of those fan out to a server somewhere. So if you want to look at the threat model for specific devices, it's more individual personal targets, more individual specifically. But when we talk about implants, you don't go into this effort investing millions of dollars for something like this. You go into, I want everything. I want everyone's data.
But what about for the stuff that MG's working on, right? So consumer level 199 things you can buy on Deal Extreme that are a cable, or what you think is a plug that has a GSM, audio receiver SPI thing that's not a hardware implant like a network style thing, but it's the practicality is there, and people, anytime you buy something from an untrusted, even on Amazon now, an untrusted source, because if it's not sold and delivered by Amazon, even if it is, you don't know, right? Everything's coming and could be modified. And what do you have? You have pictures? You want to talk about that?
I just wanted to add that on that exact topic, there are things for like $10 on Amazon, GPS tracking cables and stuff like that, hot mics that you can just light up remotely. So yes, there are malicious individuals that can leverage the type of power that we're talking about here, and that's certainly worth talking about, but certainly a very different topic that we could go into.
Depends on your attack model. Yeah.
So we only have time for one more question. And you've already asked a question, so I can't take you. Okay, we'll take you.
So if we add hardware attacks to our threat model, what are the mitigating security controls? Is it software, hardware, or combination, or something else?
Repeat the question before you answer it.
No one wants to answer because it's a really hard one. So the question was, assuming we build in hardware attacks into our threat model, what are mitigating factors we can take?
Well, it's all about detection, I think. My opinion is if you have a hardware implant, mitigating it would be a pain. But detecting a hardware implant from software it's a tough question, like Joe said. It demands a lot of creativity. Let's call it like that. It depends on each case, each hardware, each scenario, and what controls does the software have, and how much trust can the software put in those controls.
There's a lot of talk in the software world, and people want to build perfect security, and we realize it's not possible. So what we look at is the cost of attacking versus the assets you're defending. And when we talk about things in the hardware world, it's the same thing. We have things that you can do, make sure your keys are on a chip, but then it's not resistant to chip-level invasive attacks and side channel attacks. Like, these things get more expensive very quickly. They go from things that you can attack one device and break all of them to attack just one device and you only break that device, and it's destructive in the process. So looking at what mitigations you can put into place, whether they're chip level, whether they're silicon level, whether they're board level, and what the cost of an attacker is going to be over time, that's really the way to balance it that I know is possible.
And I think it goes back to like our trust model and our threat model. Like, you have to have a trust anchor somewhere, and if you know really where that trust anchor is, then you can build mitigations. The problem is that we have where we think the trust anchor is, and then all these other things that we're implicitly trusting that we don't really think that we're trusting.
And with that, I think we'll have to wrap up. Thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking the panelists for this great discussion.
Thanks very much, Kim, for coming all the way up here to join us for this panel.